Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Passionately Wrong podcast. I'm James, and I'm here together with my friend and co host, Randy. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to many of you. How do you go about getting permission to live in Europe? And by this, we mean permission from the local authorities who will potentially give you a visa. What kind of visa do you want? How hard is it to get it? And what are some of the things that you might think about in the process of considering countries and visas to pursue? Does that describe what we're going to talk about today, Randy?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I've seen a lot of memes and stuff on the social media comparing Americans' worded verbiage. Like when they move to a foreign country, they're an expat. And when people move to the United States, you're an immigrant. And so there's no difference. They're the same. But for some reason, the expat sounds better.
Yeah, it goes to the bias that we Americans have about the US being the center of the world. When you leave the US, you're expatriating, right? You're leaving someplace. And when you come to the US from not from anywhere else, you're immigrating because the US is the center of the world and you're either leaving it or coming to it. But we are not so, I won't say narrow minded. We're not so focused in our discussions, Randy, because as regular listeners know, we've lived in a number of different places, both as children with our families and then as adults, either for work or by choice then. And just a quick recap, the countries that you have lived in as an adult outside the US,
As an adult. So after high school,
whenever you're sure.
after high school, the ones I've lived in for longer than going for combat or something, not including combat and stuff that you're talking about, where I had to get some kind of visa of some sort.
Right, where it was your choice to go there, even if it was work related. I don't know how much that works in the military.
So yeah, all right. So I lived in Colombia for 4 years. I lived in Italy for 4 years, Romania, France, and Spain. I think that's about right. And then
Maybe if it's maybe if it's relevant, we can cover some other countries. I suspect it might be useful to focus on Europe, but let's see how it goes. I spent probably 6 months, if you add it all up, in Spain, but it was always 4 weeks, 2 weeks at a time. So never had to seek a visa there. So we'll rely on your experience to enlighten users. I did, however, need to obtain visas for both Germany, where we spent several years, and then Switzerland, where we spent a lot of years. And I went through three different visa processes and ultimately citizenship, which is a whole nother level, which we might address today or a future time. So I guess between the two of us, we have experience with a number of different countries.
and a number of different processes too, because it's different when you're sponsored by a company, especially if the company has like a section that's dedicated to helping you do it.
Yes, very much so. And maybe I'll start with that myself, Randy, just to point out the difference between Germany and Switzerland and the difference between Switzerland 20 years ago and Switzerland today. And in fact, for a lot of people looking to expatriate or emigrate, whatever word we want to use, to move to Europe and live there, the world is not as friendly to American citizens as it once was, just because there's so much concern about the free movement of people within Europe that within the European Union, countries have given preference to people from within the European Union, especially if you're working. Even one company that has offices in multiple places, my company found in recent years that it was almost impossible to bring someone from another part of the company who was not already within the European Union, even temporarily. You couldn't bring them for a few months from India or from the US if you couldn't demonstrate that there was no person within the European Union who could fill that role. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to prove. So ironically, traveling as it used to be that your company helping you made life much, much easier. But now going as a private citizen, you're more welcome than you might otherwise have been working for a company. So that's a change that I've observed.
Did you move to Germany and Switzerland before EU was formed?
We now, well, the European Union was there, right? The common currency came on board after we moved to Frankfurt. That was a big change. And I would say that was the 90s to 98. We were in Frankfurt and they had introduced the euro across Europe. That was a big change, but they've been harmonizing the laws across European member states for a long time. So I would say the European Union was there. It got tighter and tighter aligned. And the stuff that happened with the immigration laws and preference given for citizens from the EU to other European countries, that became a really big deal in the last 10 years, let's say. So I saw it from upfront and personal, and also saw it from the perspective of in-house counsel for my company and working with HR, trying to get employees sent over or settled on temporary assignments. Yeah. So let's talk about it, what it felt like. First of all, I laugh sometimes when people try to hold out the US for criticism about our border policies and the idea that we might in any way restrict immigrants from flowing across our borders. And I say, how can you be so cruel and mean? And I say, have you noticed the immigration policies in your country? Go try and get a permit to enter France or Germany or Spain or Switzerland. They pay attention to their borders. Nobody just wanders across and decides that they're going to become a resident of a European country. It's extremely, completely controlled. Obviously, there is a possibility for people to sneak in, but the idea that a country wouldn't enforce its borders and pay attention to who's coming in, and somehow that we can therefore criticize the US, I find a preposterous double standard. And I do not accept criticism from anyone in any country that I'm aware of when they say, you guys should be kinder and let immigrants. My answer to that is, oh, really?
I think some of that comes from all the immigrants that they accepted from the Middle East and Africa over the years, and they think that we don't want any immigrants, but they accept that, and they accept those in an official way, especially EU. EU's okay. What's everyone's capacity? You guys are going to accept this amount, and they divide it up. They have some kind of consensus, or not everyone's happy with it, but they have some kind of consensus, and they say, okay, everyone's going to absorb so many people. But the United States has more immigrants, legal and illegal, than all of.
Right. And here we do probably need to pay attention to terminology, Randy, because there's a concept of refugee, which is a person who has been forced to leave their country due to famine, war, threat, and then an immigrant who is doing so quasi-voluntarily. There's a bit of a blurry line, and this is where the US has really fiddled with the control of the border, where we consider people who are coming across as economic refugees or economic immigrants as refugees. So you're right. Europe has had to accommodate a pretty large number of real refugees, people first from the Syrian war and then disruption in Africa and now Ukraine. And that's because of geographic proximity. The US is blessed by virtue of having oceans on two sides, Canada to the top. And really our issue is potential refugees from South America coming up through Mexico. We don't have the same just basic geographic concern that Europe does about potentially being overwhelmed. Although you see in the last several years, even a country as big as the US has had real issues associated with immigration. That probably isn't the political side of it, isn't the point of our topic today. That was my fault. I brought it up just because I wanted to point out the simple point that countries carefully control the legal flow of immigrants into their country because of this pressure from all these other sources that they don't have as much control of.
Right. And one more thing before we drop this issue. So I was in Romania, which borders Ukraine, obviously. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the Ukraine has multiple borders, one with Poland, one with Romania. And there's obviously Ukrainian citizens, the women and children and the men who were too young or too old to fight, who could go across the border, who were allowed to go across the border. And then there was all the foreigners that were in Ukraine. There was a lot of Africans who had student visas and a variety of other people that had different kinds of visas, but weren't citizens. And when the attack came, there were very specific rules on television, radio, social media, everything. Like Ukrainians head for Poland. You're being permitted into the EU, into the Schengen, the borderless Schengen area. And all other foreigners who are not citizens head for Romania. And we will contact and because once you get across the border that's part of the Schengen, as you know, James, maybe not all our listeners do, you have free reign to go anywhere in Europe, and no one can figure out where you are unless you report to someone and say, or get arrested, or you have to turn some paperwork in to get a job or something, and then they'll start tracking you. But you could go from Poland all the way to Portugal and no one would ever know, because there's no border patrol, there's no checkpoints, there's nothing. It's just like the United States as far as crossing states. And they wanted control. They accepted that the Ukrainians were refugees and needed to get out, but everyone else who had student visas who couldn't go to school anymore and other things, they could just go home. And they were actually the European Union was willing to pay for their tickets home. but they didn't want to go home. And so they kept really going to the Polish border and making it more crowded than it had to be. And then they were getting turned away at the border and said, hey, you need to go to the Romanian border. That's where the rest of you guys go. And then all this social media started coming up like they were being racist because they weren't letting us get out. And the reality was they're letting them get out of Romania. And Romania was super generous. They set up all these free things on the cities along the border for food and shelter. And it wasn't like 10 cities either. It was like hotels and everything. And it was all part of money they were throwing at this to help people out. And the people that got across the border, they had nothing but great things to say. The Romanians were so great to us. Even some Ukrainians ended up going that way too, because it was, in some cases, it was easier to get across the Romanian border and they just wanted to get out. But
So here, no, it's these things have put pressure on countries. And that's why we're more focused on immigration and the requirement to get a visa than we ever have been. And there's another trend that's worth mentioning, which is simply the global population has grown enormously in the last 100 years. And therefore, back in 1920, when the League of Nations Convention was established, which gave rise to the system of passports and visas that we still use today, the population of the world was about 1 billion people. And then by 1950, it had doubled to 2 billion. And then in the last 70 years, it's doubled twice more, first to 4 billion and now 8 billion. And the world's a big place, of course, and people live all over it, but people traveling, the same percentage of people traveling when there's 1 billion people in the world versus 8 billion people in the world. And of course, I think more people are traveling today, percentage wise, than ever before. There's huge movements of people, which makes also for voluntary purposes. So everyone who's gone on a 2-week trip to Europe just to go and visit and come back has actually done so with an exception to the visa requirement. It's not that there was no issue. It's just that for people from certain backgrounds, certain countries, and certain passports, you are assumed to not be a great risk of overstaying your stay. So you are given a visa waiver or an exception to the requirement to obtain a visa. Otherwise, every time you go from one country to another, in principle, the default is you got to have some sort of visa in order to do that, unless you qualify for a waiver program. It's worth pointing out to people that a lot of countries don't have anywhere near the same flexibility that a citizen from most EU countries and the United States have in traveling to other countries in the world. People from lots of places do need to get a visa, even if they are intending to go for a short stay. And that's a really burdensome, difficult process. What we're going to talk about today, Randy, I think is not a short, I need to go visit a place for 2 weeks or for a conference or something, but I'd like to go and spend 6 months, a year, an indeterminate amount of time in a country. And that is, even for Americans and Europeans, a more lengthy and rigorous visa application process. What was it like your most recent move to Spain from Romania in terms of establishing yourself and getting a visa? Was the process aided by virtue of your spouse being a European citizen, or did you really address it from an American perspective, or how did you guys do it?
I'd actually probably start with when I got out of the army and moved to Romania. I think the Eastern European countries, especially the ones that aren't part of the Schengen, because the Schengen forces a set of rules on everyone in the Schengen that, hey, this is the requirements for acceptance and to work in the Schengen area. Because once you're in Schengen, you can move around. So Romania was I wasn't married at the time. I was single. And I applied for basically a digital nomad visa, though they didn't have that name back then. It was a funny process because it was the other. There's all these things, right? And then there was other. And it said, for example, this and this. And I was like, for example, so therefore other could be other things. So I read all their rules. I went and applied. I gave the lady all my paperwork and she's like, why are you here? I was like, I felt like I wanted to stay here. She's like, but you need a reason. I was like, why? As I meet your minimum requirement with my military retirement for finances. So I'm an author and I'm writing a book and I wanted to do it here because I like the cost of living and I like the people. And I had to write a statement. That was part of the process. And I had a statement in Romanian and English and I gave it to her. I was like, it's right there. She's like, well, why are you here? I was like, I want to write a book in Romania. That's why, and then she showed me the regulations. Like, you have to choose one of these. I was like, yes, I did. It's other. It only includes these three. It's like, it says other, for example. So obviously there's other things included. And I was having an argument with the whatever, the lady, whatever her agent, the agent or whatever, the immigration agent, there was only two in there and she was raising her voice. I was very calm. And then the manager came out. He's, hey, it's time for lunch. Are you guys ready? He's like, what's going on here? He's like, he has no reason. He has no purpose. That was the word. Her English was great. He has no purpose being here. I was like, sir, I want to be here for another reason. He's like, why can't he be here for another reason? Because he has to have a purpose, sir. He's like, why are you here? And I showed him the thing and he's like, that's good. That's another reason. Just check the other and just go to lunch. And so that's how I got in the first time. But I had to explain their rules to them because especially Romania was communist, whatever, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, however long ago. And they still have these things in place and then they're very set in their ways. And she was an older lady. She might've been there during communism. I don't know. And so it was, and then the manager was younger. The manager was probably in late 30s or something like that. And he was good with it.
So while I find the discussion of you having no purpose, Randy, amusing, of course, it's not true under any circumstance, but the story does highlight something that I've observed in other countries. And it's a really important point for people seeking a residence permit to understand. And that is the local immigration authorities have an immense amount of power. And it's not a question of you having the better argument or reading the statute correctly. Oftentimes doesn't matter one bit. If that person takes a disliking to you, if they don't like your face, I don't want to overstate it, but I've seen arbitrary decisions that you can't challenge. They're like, nah, I don't think I'm going to give you a visa. Your only choice is to go and try again later with somebody else, which might be really inconvenient, time-consuming, expensive. And that's just on the residence permit. The more you're seeking, right, a green card, something that really allows you to get closer to staying in that country and getting the benefits of being a citizen in that country, the say-so of local authorities is absolute. And learning how to work with that system and to answer questions in the right way becomes really important because you get a bad day and a bad person, you might have a different outcome.
So having worked in a number of U.S. embassies, I would say that we have the same thing.
Oh, do we?
Someone could get up on the wrong side of bed and decide that I don't think you're going to be a good fit in the United States. And I've seen it. I've seen someone go and get turned down and then go back with the same paperwork and see a different agent and be completely fine. My second wife was Peruvian. She went after 9/11 and was turned down. And then she went a couple months later and I wrote her a note and she got it. It was, I wrote her a note, but who am I? I'm just a soldier. I wasn't even working.
Right. So I think the point here is it's not to cast aspersion on any country, other than to say every country does this through bureaucrats or officers who are responsible for implementing those rules. And they are people, and you may have good luck or bad luck depending upon how you come across that day with that person. I saw many, what seemed to me, cruel decisions from the immigration authorities when we went to Frankfurt. My company was helping us and helped us make sure that everything was filled out correctly, but we still had to go to that office many times and there'd be long lines of people waiting in these sad waiting rooms. The person who would see you would be available between 10:30 and 11:15 on Tuesday. And by God, if you weren't there in time on that day, they didn't care what was going on at work or whether you had a doctor's appointment. You had to be there when they called you or you missed it. And then I saw many times that you go in and there'd be a line of 20 people waiting. They take the first 5 people and then everyone else had to go home and come back next week. It was,
I did my research on, I was thinking about Portugal or Greece. They have really low cost of living. And then I ended up in Romania because of my girlfriend, now my wife. But every country, even though they're all part of the EU or Schengen, then there's some minimum threshold of what has to happen to let people in that they've all agreed to. They all have different requirements. Some of them you have to apply in your home country or wherever you're a resident at. And some of them, like Romania, I applied when I was in Romania. I was visiting her on it, and I had because of virtue of my US passport, I was allowed to go for 3 months to Romania. And so I showed up and I went to the thing. I filled out the paperwork. I gave it to him. So a month later, I had a 1 year visa, a 1 year resident card. I had to renew it every year. And every year it was another challenge. Like, you have no purpose. I had the same purpose. No, I tried to make eye contact with the person that was there for the no purpose argument because some of those guys rotate out and some of them they're there. And I'm also very, so my wife is, don't do that because I brought them, I was like, oh, thank you so much. You guys are so helpful after it was all done. I got my card and when I went to pick up my card, I dropped off a box of chocolates and they're like, don't do that. This is a communist place. They think you're bribing them. I was like, I already got my card. How is that a bribe? He's like, they'll look at it differently. But guess what? A year later, they remember me. I showed up, remember me, and they're like, hey, what's going on? You have purpose now? Yes, I do. So I renewed that thing like 4 years in a row now, but they're like, France, you have to apply if you're living in the United States, when you apply and you don't have a residency anywhere else, you have to apply from the United States. Even if you come there on a tourist visa, the 3-month tourist thing, you can't apply while you're in France. You have to go back, apply in the United States and wait for the result. And,
Right.
and so every country is different.
Right. So the recommendation for sure would be to research at home before you make any plans, the requirements of the country or countries that are on your list. There's tons of good information available. Talk to somebody who's already done it and been there if you can find them. There's Facebook groups, online forums. So the other thing that you mentioned, which we should spend some time on, unless you want to comment on that. I was just going to say that.
I was be careful of not be careful. A lot of these people, there's agencies out there that'll walk you through it for $600, $800 or whatever, and they'll do the paperwork for you. And you can, if you have the money and you just want to make it easy for yourself, then go ahead and do it. But you don't have to. I didn't do it in Romania. I did it all myself. There's like I had to pay like $35 or something for the administration fee or something, but that was it. As opposed to applying for a visa for the United States costs like $800. I don't know if everyone knows that. When people are applying legally, it costs money. So
a significant amount. And the US has upped its fees for all sorts of visas, and other countries may do so as well. I agree, Randy. Most of this stuff, if you can get the form in a language that you can read, then just reading it and seeing what's required of you is anyway a good idea. Even if someone is helping you fill it out, you probably want to know what you're saying and what you are affirming when you sign that form and send it in. I'm biased, but I always have a preference for seeing and reading the things that you're filling out. And if you're patient and smart, you'll be able to fill out almost all of these forms.
the interesting thing was my girlfriend at the time, we need to hire someone because there's so much red tape and it's all communist procedures and protocols and stuff. I was like, here's the rules. But that's not the way it works. You don't understand the way it works. It's like, let's try it without, because I called an agency and they wanted to you have to have a purpose. He's like, we can set you up with that. You can be the head of a charity. We can make a business thing. For 1,000 euros, we can set you up a business and then you have your own business here. And I'm like, none of that sounds fun. I don't want to do that. I just want to be here to write my book. Can that be my purpose? He's like, no. I was like, what about other? No one uses that. I was like, I'm going to use it. So I went and it worked. And she was surprised. She was very surprised. And none of her friends thought it was going to work either. I'm also I'm very cheery.
I would say persistent in a way that is not offensive, which is sometimes quite helpful. You mentioned it a couple times, and I will reiterate that your visa is of a limited duration. So if you have an exemption from the visa requirement to go and visit Europe, it'll be for 90 days or less, right? Big and bad things will happen if you overstay your requirement. And this is why some countries won't even let you apply from within their borders. They don't want anyone to be caught off guard and not have a plane ticket back home again. They just want you to stay for as long as you're allowed to stay. Switzerland starts with temporary visas for workers who come for the ski season, for example, and they're going to work in a hotel. So that's your 90 days. And by God, you got to be done. That's getting a limited work visa. Normally, I would say the routine is to give you a 1-year visa for a residency, someone coming in, whatever they call it, and then you have to renew it. And sometimes you keep renewing it for multiple years until you can apply for a different kind that maybe goes longer. Switzerland has A permits, B permits, and C permits. The first one is for 1 year. Then you can get them for 5 years. They want to see, are you reliable? Did you pay your taxes if you're earning income? Did you make a claim for social services, or what kind of a resident are you? And that's why they want you to come back every year or every so often. At least that's my experience.
So and I think maybe I've misrepresented what happened. So I didn't apply for a visa to work. in Romania. I applied on virtue of my retirement pay, which was, I think they required it to be 3 times their minimum wage, which was like $3,000 or something. And so I just gave them what my government gives me for my retirement. Said, yeah, and I translated it and I said, see, I make more than 3,000. And they just didn't have a problem with that. And they said, what are you going to do here? It's like, I'm an author. I'm going to write, and maybe I'll sell a book. I don't know. And they said, no purpose. No. And so can the normal person do that? Can a 25-year-old person out of college move and get a 1-year visa? It'd be difficult to get a work visa. There's a lot of digital nomad visas now in a lot of these European countries. So you have to prove I think you have to have, so each one's a little different, but you got to prove like for 2 years through your, whatever you were doing digitally nomadically, you were making a minimum amount of money every year. And then you can come there, and it's a really easy visa, right? You just pay your US taxes. Some of them make you have a minimum you have to pay, like a very small amount to the country. Some of them, you don't pay anything. You just pay US taxes. You bring your own health insurance, which is, you can buy health insurance in these countries for $3,000 a year or something like that, $2,500, depending on which one covered. They have a minimum amount that you should get covered. And that's an option. Or you can go to college overseas. It's cheaper. Is it easier to get in? It's not. I don't think it's as easy as the United States is, especially like state universities and community college. You have to qualify, but you can get a visa to go to college. I think there's like nanny visas in a lot of these countries but most of them are like European transfer visas, like Britain and stuff like that. I don't know if they have nannies from the US or not, but work visas are usually require companies. Like you come with a job, and like you said, your job can't be done by any Europeans because by virtue of they're trying to hire within the EU. So in my case, it was just, I make enough money to meet their minimum requirement. So I just had to figure out a way through their red tape to get there, whether it was a digital nomad visa or another or something like that. And then on the backwards side of that, once I got my residency in Romania, I applied for 3 years later, after COVID, I applied for a visa for France, but I could do it in Romania. I didn't have to go back to the US because I had a residency card. So I showed up at the French embassy in Bucharest, and I'm like, hey, I have to apply for a visa to France. And they're like, you have to go back to the United States. They're like, oh, but I have a residency card for Romania. And they're like, oh, well, then you're in the right place. And the thing was, no one's applying for a visa, a resident visa for France from Romania because it's an EU country. So they can just go. So none of the Romanians are, and a very few apparently expats that live in Romania are trying to get visas to France either, because there is no line. Like I showed up and they're like, okay, give me your passport. We'll call you in a couple of days. So I gave them the paperwork. I paid the 35 euros, gave them my passport. They called me 3 days later, come pick up your visa. And I had a 1-year visa. And that was the fastest I'd ever got a visa in my life. And if you look at all the horror stories in social media and forums and stuff in the States, it's 6 months, years, or whatever to go to the consulates in France and the United States. Well, it was pretty simple for me.
Right. So to the extent that you can work an angle to make your application process easier, maybe you have a relative who came from Germany, and although you never did it before, you realize, whoops, I actually could apply for German citizenship. Don't do that rashly, by the way. There's strings that come attached with becoming a resident of a country, at least if you intend to go live there.
You intend to work there, because there's...
Yes. Yeah. I would say it used to be standard to have your company sponsor you for a work visa when you went to a place, and that worked well for a long time. The work visa is by far the hardest one to get now. The retiree visa is reasonably easy, provided you have the financial means to satisfy that country's requirements. I think Switzerland's requirements are so high that most people, even from the US, wouldn't qualify. They just don't need any more wealthy retirees there. So they make it hard. And then the global nomad, however, is probably going to be something of interest if you don't go for the retiree visa. But there's strings attached, and that's what maybe we should spend a few minutes talking about, Randy. You mentioned this on one of our earlier podcasts, I think. The visa is just one thing, and getting the visa does not mean the end of your challenges of moving to and living in that country. Something as simple as, can I get a bank account here? Can I rent a place here? Those two things all by themselves are surprisingly difficult. We're so used to the US being like, yeah, whatever. you can walk in and walk out with a bank account and with an apartment within an hour in the same day. That will
Yeah.
not happen with the same quickness in most European countries. They really do not make it easy to open a bank account, to rent an apartment.
I think that if I had tried to get a bank account in Romania, I think it would have been pretty simple. But because I had an address, I signed a lease. In order to get my visa for Romania, I had to have a 1-year lease. And I was there, I was present in the country. So my girlfriend and I looked at a couple apartments and we signed a lease, and that we could break if I didn't get the visa. And so that worked fine. But I never needed a bank account there. When I got my visa to France, I had to show 3 months that I had a place to live for the next 3 months. And I got an Airbnb, and I just went, and they're like, sure, no problem. And when I got there, in order to rent a house, I needed a French bank account. It was a requirement. No one would go around it. So I started looking for rentals, and they wanted a packet like that to rent a house in France. And one of it was I needed a bank. So I went to the banks, and the banks wouldn't give me the time of day because I didn't have a permanent residence. I was in an Airbnb. I would have to communicate with the Airbnb to fill out a document saying that I could use this as a place to get my mail, like as a residence for the next whatever months. And it was so complicated. It finally, once again, consistency and not giving up, resiliency. I kept going to banks, and my girlfriend was done. And I was like, let's try this one. And I walked in, there's no one in there except for the people that work there. And I went and explained in my really crappy French to the secretary what I wanted to open an account. So they set me up with this nice young lady who was half Italian and half French. And she spoke perfect English because she went to school in the States. And I said, hey, here's my problem. I've been to 15 banks. No one will give me an account. I'm just trying to rent a house. And she's, oh my God, France is I'm Italian and half French. And the same problem. It was just such a pain in the ass. There's so much red tape. Let's figure this out. And she's like, do you have a friend that we can send like a code for your bank information? Cause they're really serious about like we're going to text you one part of your bank code and send the other to your physical address so that no one can act like they're you, which makes perfect sense if you can find an address. Permanent address, because we don't want some guy acting like you get an Airbnb with not a permanent address and then whatever. And I was like, it all makes sense. It's just really difficult. And so, yeah, I had a friend, a British friend I knew they were from the UK when I was in Kuwait that were living in France. And I was like, hey, Jen, can I use your address? And they're going to send you a code. Then you just need to give me the code. And they're like, yeah, no problem. So I was like, okay, we solved the problem. We did it. But yeah, it was really difficult. I guess another problem is as Americans, we're used to driving everywhere. As an American in Europe, you want to travel a lot, but getting a driver's license it's as hard and unique as in every country. Every country is different, just like every state's different, right? In a way, but some countries in Europe have a reciprocity agreement with some states, not all states in the United States. And if you have a Texas driver's license and you move to France, with the first year you're there, you can fill out some paperwork, mail your Texas driver's license in, and they'll give you a French one in return. And I guess Texas does that for French citizens, but not all states do it. Only some states. And in the case of Spain, where I live now, they don't do that. So I have to go through a course, and I have to take a written test or a computer test in Spanish, and I have to take a practical test, and I have to pay $400. And if I don't pass practical and the written, then I have to pay another $400 till I pass. And by the way, parallel parking is a big thing in Europe. So
right, and you may have to take your test on a manual car, not on an automatic,
right.
if you want to get a license.
And the police give you your car. The police are the ones that test you, and they don't test you in your car. They test you in their car that has a steering wheel and a brake on both sides. And so it's probably a manual. And so if you're not used to, you haven't driven a manual a while, you're going to have to figure that out. And so I can't drive my wife's car. My American license was good for 6 months after I got here with an international driver's permit, but the permit's not a license. All it does is translate my license. And the law here is that after you've been here for 6 months, it's void. You got to get one of their license, which is silly. It just sounds like a money thing, really. Because if you're going to let me drive for 6 months, well, why?
I'm not really a danger.
That's right. You don't see me as a dangerous person. So it's silly, but that's the rule, right? And every country is something different. And every country has like the horror stories of their driver's test, especially the written one. The written one is supposed to be like none of the questions are like straight up front. Like it's obviously A. It could be A, B, and it might even be C if your Spanish is bad. And so you have to go to these courses because they go over and over and over these tests to make sure that you understand, you can interpret the questions correctly because they're all nebulous. And
Right. It's not at all like getting your license in the US where it's routine and quick and easy, and a person can easily pass the written and the practical test without really understanding anything about the rules of the road or how to drive, depending on what state you're in. Seriously, if I compare it to how it works in other countries like you're describing, it's very rigorous. What I would say, I remember when
if you're an adult driver in the United States, you could just go challenge the test. I did. I never learned how to drive until I got to college when I was 19. I didn't go to driver's ed or nothing.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And basically I decided I want to get a car. They have the study guide in the DMV. I got it. Okay. And I took the test, and then I failed the first time. And then the guy was nice. It was like, you did this wrong. It's a 3-point turn, not a 6-point turn. Austin Powers. I was like, and then I was like, okay. And then I was like, when can I take it again? He's like, well, you can take it here tomorrow, or you can drive it across town since our computers don't talk, and you can take it at one of the differences before computers, really. You can take it at another DMV across town if they got an opening. I was like, oh, okay. So I looked it up in the old pages, back in the old pages, drove to the other side of town, took it again the same day, that afternoon, pass. And then I didn't drive for 2 weeks because I was scared because I didn't know how to drive. My friends drove my car. I bought a car, but I didn't know how to, they drove it off the lot for me.
I would say what we're talking about, Randy, are things that are incident to moving to a new country, which we've highlighted a few times before. The visa is a big one, of course, and is the foundation that should be your threshold. If I can figure out how to get a visa, then I'll at least be able to go and stay in this country. But you should then expect that you're going to encounter potentially differences in what it's like to get a place to stay, figure out how to do your banking, and figure out how to get around. What I wanted to add to this is two things. It's helpful, in my experience, to have a mindset that expects and anticipates things will be different, and to not automatically assume that different is worse. Some things are different and you might find them better, but to know that you're going to a new country, it would actually be odd to have everything work exactly the same as it did back home in Texas or wherever you're from. So knowing and anticipating, hey, it's going to be different and weird and sometimes great, that's a good mindset to go in with. And the second thing that's related to the first is you might do things differently than you would at home. So you said, you're most likely going to want to travel around. You're going to want to visit places in Europe. I agree. You should, but you don't need to drive to a lot of places. You can take public transportation in a way that you would never even consider doing in the US because our public transportation isn't always great. But in Europe, in a lot of countries, it is great. You can get a bus, you can get a train, you can get around without a car quite conveniently. And even being open to the idea of observing a little bit, how do people get around here? I can take an overnight train to Paris or Venice, and that's a very different experience and might enrich your time abroad rather than trying to recreate everything as you had it back home.
Yeah, especially since gas prices are so high in Europe, it makes more sense to take a train to Paris than to drive.
Yeah. All right. So anything that we want to conclude with in terms of passionately wrong, having a purpose, we have taken the lesson, Randy, but
so I guess my cautionary tale of moving to Europe is make sure you understand the rules. And just because you understand them better than the officials doesn't mean you're going to get in, but at least you'll be able to point some things out. And maybe if you embarrass them, they will just like whatever, and you'll have to go apply somewhere else. Don't give up. You can always apply somewhere, unless it's like something like it's a red line, like you don't qualify. But if it's just a misunderstanding of the rules, feel free to go to another place and see what they say. I'm not even sure they're talking to each other sometimes. Maybe they are. Didn't you just go to the other one? Yeah, but they said they try this place. They don't, they weren't like telling stories over lunch saying this guy came in. So don't feel free to try again. Also, you need to really, I would get onto some Facebook forums of expats in that country they'll have information on there. They'll have documents with information like, hey, here's how you get your license. Here's how you do this. These are the reciprocity things. You can find a lot of that in Google searches. Driver's license is going to be a big thing if you're going to, and also bringing a US car is expensive and maybe not the smartest thing because you're going to have to get it converted. And most places you're not going to be able to drive it off the boat and start driving it across Europe. You have to do a lot of changes to it. So it might be better off for you to buy a used car or a new car in Europe if you're actually going to use a car. I would also
I'm going to go so far as to just reinforce that point, Randy, and advise: do not bring a vehicle. It is asking for trouble, time, cost, conversion. You're going to stand out like a beached whale. Your car is not appropriate for Europe, period. And it's more fun to get a little European car when you're there and just go. Yeah, don't do it. You can tell an expat who's brought their car with them, just like you can tell an American on a 2-week vacation. Don't do it if you wish to have a local experience.
And that also goes for, you might want to come to Europe with a minimalist attitude. I came with 2 suitcases and no furniture and nothing. But the big thing is US furniture won't fit in a lot of these houses, especially if you're living in a big city. You may not even be able to get it in that house because it won't fit through the door. It won't fit up the stairs. It won't fit around through the window. And so in Italy, that was a big deal. And you may have a 4-room house, but each room's the size of your bathroom back at your master bathroom in some cases. So a big king size beds is the whole room in some cases, or maybe more than the room. And you'll have to cut off a piece of your mattress. I looked at a house in Italy. The room was the size of my queen size. Like the only thing would fit in there was the mattress, literally. I was like, oh my gosh. So you really think about what you can't live without, whether you want to store it in case you ever come back to the US or just sell it and then buy new stuff here. If you're going to rent in Europe, almost all rentals come furnished, whether you like it or not. And so in a way, you won't have to worry about the furniture, and some of it's non-negotiable. So if you want to find an unfurnished one, that's something different. And there's less choices in a lot of places. So you may just want to get a furnished rental for a while and figure it out before you move here with all your stuff, and find some place to store it in the States would be my suggestion. I came to Europe in the military, and they shipped 10,000 pounds worth of stuff and my car for me. And I shipped my car back when I got out, and I gave it to my son, and I sold everything. And then I moved with 2 suitcases to Romania. And I haven't missed anything.
So I think we should have a follow-up episode on minimalism because that topic is worth exploring in more detail, Randy. All right. So those are good tips. I think whenever we talk about this topic, it always feels a little bit pessimistic to me, Randy, because we spend the whole time pointing out difficulties, pitfalls, and issues. We don't want to dissuade anyone from pursuing the grand adventure. It is fun moving to and living in other places. Just expect there to be differences and for you to have to go through some exciting challenges as it comes to figuring out your new place of abode. But don't be dissuaded from doing it.
We didn't even get to taxes, which is a whole other thing. So when you're looking at you're going to stay in it, and especially if you're going to work, and even if you're not going to work, if you have a retirement or something, you just need to do a real good research about how you're going to get taxed, because you may not be walking away at the end of the year with as much money as you think.
And to add to that, good point, Randy, we were going to talk about that, and maybe we just highlight it as a thing to pay careful attention to because it's complex. I will say that one of the reasons countries are relaxing their residency requirements for Americans in particular is that they wish to get you into their tax net. And Spain now has a global wealth tax that applies to U.S. residents. France is considering reimposing their wealth tax. Switzerland has a global wealth tax. It's an unusual thing, and countries haven't had them for long, but it could have a very surprising consequence to you if you've saved money and have assets back in the US, to find that your new host country wishes to apply a tax to it in a way that you didn't expect, in addition to all the local taxes that you're paying into their social security system or maybe their healthcare system. So yes, taxes are one of the reasons that countries grant residencies to people rather than a tourist doesn't get taxed. But if you become a resident, yeah, you're going to be introduced into their tax system. And it shouldn't come as a surprise, but the extent of the taxes is a surprise.
And that's also dependent on the type of visa you have. So if you get the digital nomad visas, you're not paying local taxes really. So that kind of gets away. If you're here as a student, you're not paying local taxes. If you're here on a retirement visa, you're paying minimal taxes as long as you're not working and doing something on the side. So you just have to look at and every country's different. You just got to look at it just so you know what you're going to be living off of.
Okay. All right. Well, we hope we gave you some food for thought. If you've got specific questions or issues you'd like us to follow up on, drop us a comment. We're always happy to hear from listeners and watchers. Have a good day, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.
Talk to you later. We'd love to hear what you think, so please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.